let us zoom in again to cover another aspect of the Edo period Japanese culture, and certainly an aspect of Japanese culture that was very important in the lives of many samurai, and that is prostitution. Prostitution during the Edo period underwent some very important changes. During the early Edo period, just as during basically the entirety of the medieval period, encompassing both the Kamakura period and the Muromachi period, much of prostitution, certainly there were very high cultured courtesans, but there were also just a great many exploitative, brutal brothels where displaced persons from war and daughters that farmer families could not afford to keep ended up. And there was a great deal of brutality associated with this type of prostitution. Although, of course, mind you that I am oversimplifying things for the sake of just basically giving a lecture on it. The reality is always much more convoluted. But in broad terms, what happened during the Edo period is that prostitution was brought more and more under samurai control. Certainly, the Bakufu did this, and after the Bakufu did this, other domains throughout the Tokugawa polity followed suit. Why control this prostitution? Why not just end it if you thought that it was evil, or why not just leave it alone if you thought that it was fine? Well, it was seen as evil by Confucian scholars, but it was also seen as necessary by many other scholars and by samurai bureaucrats, and it was seen as necessary because there was this assumption that samurai men who could not achieve sexual release would do things like rape, and they would also riot and possibly try to overthrow the government. You didn't want that, now did you? So you came to a uncomfortable compromise where you wanted to regulate this prostitution while realizing that it is, while considering that it is certainly an evil practice, but also, you know, in Japanese there's a great expression, shikata ga nai, there's no help, there's nothing to be done for it, you know. And so you had prostitution come under government control, which means under government regulation. There were different classes of prostitution, of venues rather, for prostitution. Basically, the way that this worked is establishments received licenses to carry on, basically to become prostitution houses. Individual prostitutes did not apply for work permits or things like that. What happened is the owners of these establishments formed networks with each other and kind of formed sometimes citywide and even region-wide establishments. There were also local operations, but basically if you got licensed, then you took women under contract to serve as a prostitute for this or that many years. They would pay for their own training, and then they would pay back their masters for that training. And as I've said many times before, these were not samurai women. Now, this was a exploitative system in many respects. It was clear that the terms of the contracts were very often stacked towards the to over-represent the interests of the brothel owners rather than the women who were signing them. But that being said, there was no real burning shame associated with becoming a prostitute. It wasn't seen in an entirely positive light. It was seen kind of as a tragic thing. But these women were not shameful, and if you did manage, these women were not shamed, rather, just for being prostitutes. But if you managed to save up money, which many of them did, and by basically repay the owners of your brothel for your training, which many which many prostitutes did, you could leave that world and open up a business for yourself or get married. If you opened up a business for yourself, you usually opened up a brothel. You oftentimes maintained a relationship with your previous bosses, kind of benefited from their political arrangements and their licenses. It was, with all of its abuses, with the violence that still happened there, with the infectious diseases that these women were exposed to, with their loss of control over their lives when they were employed. I mean, many of them could not leave the grounds of the brothel or the prostitution district where they were. With all of that, for some women, prostitution did become a way to ensure a comfortable life or an independent life, or in many cases both. As I said, there were prostitution districts, the most famous one being the Yoshiwara in Edo, which does not survive anymore, but which was basically, it had the Japan-wide reputation of being the classiest, the most high-status concentration of brothels in Japan, period, and where you basically walked by and viewed women kind of on display between these wooden slats. Sometimes you were pulled into these establishments, or you just went in and you got paired up and you paid, and then you spent a variable amount of time together, and some prostitutes were just providing sexual services, but the higher status prostitutes provided entertainment, art. They sang, they danced. Many of them were skilled in conversing about poetry, and there was a range of services you could get. This is also an interesting or a good place to mention the misconception that prostitutes and geisha were the same. Prostitutes and geisha were not the same. Geisha were very much coming from a tradition of being entertainers and these kind of cultural icons first, and some of them did provide sexual services to select clients, but by no means were all geisha providing sexual services, and they were certainly under no obligation to do so. It was their choice to enter into these kinds of relationships with certain rich patrons, whereas prostitutes started from the assumption that their primary duty was to provide sexual favors for their customers. Although in some ways they were fairly similar, the business model for a lot of people who ran geisha houses was in many ways similar to the owners of houses of prostitution, with contracts and periods of indentured servitude and so on and so forth. But really, they were not the same institution. But there was plenty of room in the cities of Edo, Japan, for both. So there were these high-class prostitution districts like Yoshiwara, and then there were different venues. There were also licensed brothels in smaller cities and in post towns along the roads, but there were also unlicensed operations, even basically the equivalent of streetwalkers, independent prostitutes who operated outside the law and lived a very precarious existence. But overall, it was a society where sex for sale was readily available. By the way, just want you to look at this picture for a little bit. Now this is of the Yoshiwara. Does anybody notice anything funny about the men? Many of them are actually catfish. This was a kind of a genre of woodblock prints called namazue, where people were basically anthropomorphized as catfish. It was a thing, apparently, in Edo, Japan. Just thought you'd like to know that. Okay, so how did the samurai respond to this? Well, as I mentioned earlier, many of them loved it. Many of them loved this vibrant consumer culture. Many of them enjoyed getting out and meeting all sorts of different people, or just, going out and getting really drunk. Many samurai got lost in this kind of a world. Many of them drank to excess. Many of them spent money they absolutely did not have. And this became problematic for many of them. As the Edo period wore on, as their income stagnated while the costs of living went up, and while there were more and more strains on the finances of the daimyo, in part due to certain economic trends, which we'll be talking about later, in part due to Bakufu directives to fortify the sea coast and things like that. Basically, life became more precarious for lower and even middle income samurai, and many of them were still deeply attached to many of the pleasures of this new world and found themselves in dangerous positions. Domains, the Bakufu and individual samurai try to adapt. There's a series of wonderful studies done. One of my favorite studies is by a scholar named Dr. Konstantin Vaporus, who found correspondence between a samurai living in the domain of Tosa, a big but relatively isolated domain, and his merchant creditor that talks about how in debt these samurai were, how they borrowed money from merchants to cover expenses for months and sometimes even years ahead, how they were always trying to just barely be able to pay the interest rate on many of their loans. And many of these samurai, like the ones that Vaporus looked at, didn't even seem to be, addicted to anything. Didn't seem to be spending lots of money on entertainment. But that temptation was also there, and many samurai, certainly Katsu Kokichi, and samurai like him, who you will read about for next week, kind of just got lost in this bright, glittering world, and weren't really thought of as very good samurai by other more frugal types. The temptations were also there. Some samurai did intermarry with merchants, and that helped some of them. And some samurai even went back to farming. Of course, this was not what you were supposed to do, and so, it was at the discretion of the lord whether or not you would allow your samurai to farm, but many domains had these kinds of programs in response to these new economic demands. And some samurai also resisted, intellectually more so than militarily, but there was a development of a strain of samurai thought saying something to the effect of, oh my goodness, we'd better go back to basics, we'd better learn how to be frugal, or else we are going to lose our identity as warriors, and that'll be deeply troubling for all concerned.